Hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you are logging in from. Uh, my name is Jeevan. We'll go about having this session on governance, risk, and compliance. So this is the session on governance, risk, and compliance. Before we get started, a brief introduction about InfosecTrain. Now, they are in the industry of providing security training. They also provide some of the consulting. So if you are in requirement for taking up courses relative to the ones which are offered by ISC Square, ISACA, CIPM, CIPT, etc. Please feel free to reach out to the point of contact that you have with InfosecTrain, and they'll be able to assist you in it. Okay, so they provide a lot of professional training programs, certification, and consulting services, and they have been in the industry for a long period of time, and they have the relevant expertise relative to the areas that they are in the business. So the key clients who are partnering with InfosecTrain relative to any of the requirements on the courses for information security are listed out here. As you can see, some of the big names have definitely partnered with InfosecTrain for their training requirements. So that's about the introduction on the InfosecTrain community. Having stated that, um, this course or this session is on governance, risk, and compliance, and we will be talking about managing risk in digital space. And my name is Jeevan. Uh, Professionally, I am an experienced senior auditor with Manpower Group, and I associate myself with InfosecTrain in delivering courses relative to CISSP, CCSP, CSAM, CISA, C-Risk, CCAK, CCSK, etc. So I specialize in IT risk and compliance related domains. So during this session today, we will discuss about the importance of the policy infrastructure relative to what should be included within the policy and how these policies and procedures and applicable guidelines basically shape an organization's governance, risk, and compliance program. We'll have an in-depth evaluation of the life cycle of the risk management function within an organization relative to how to identify these risks, how to evaluate and assess those identified risks, how to treat those risks, and how to monitor the actions or the controls which are implemented in order to address the risks that are being identified. We'll discuss about the risk registers, as in how the risks are supposed to be captured and documented and tracked within a risk register. And we'll also discuss about the governance strategies and risk management strategies for some of the emerging technology areas which have kind of become a more relevant in the current marketplace and in the current industry as well, and what risk these emerging technology areas bring back to the organization and how to deal with it. So some of those areas we'll take a look on. We'll evaluate how IT audits are carried out by taking risk and its input and what how risk basically becomes a factor in driving your audit scope and evaluating the control posture or security posture of an organization while you're doing these IT audits. Those are something that we'll be discussing, and we'll see how you need to be kind of proposing a business case relative to treating a particular risk that has been identified to your management, and what are the factors that are supposed to be considered during that particular exercise. Having stated that, let's get started. So governance basically is a process wherein the senior leadership within the organization establish written rules. Okay, so the rules are designed with an objective to have strategic control over some of the business functions that are running within the organization, and in order to frame these rules, a lot of supplementary artifacts are created. Like, say, for an example, you need to have a policy infrastructure in place, which will have subsidiary parameters like standards, guidelines, procedural requirements, etc. As an organization, from a leadership, you need to establish what is the goals, objective based on the mission and vision of the organization. And you need to delegate some of the authorities relative to implementation of the expectations of your goals and objectives, as well as what is mandated through the policies, and establish a framework through which you need to validate and monitor whether the rules that you have established from a leadership perspective are being adequately followed on ground. Okay, so basically, by establishing a proper governance framework, you can establish what you would call as a continuous oversight of uh, how the organization uh, how the organization is operating, how the different business processes within the organizations are operating, to ensure that the business processes are actually working towards meeting the organization's goals and objectives. Okay, so you may find that in the board of directors, the governance functionality is being delivered through multiple committees, like, say, for an example, the audit committee, the steering committees, the uh, strategic committees, etc. Sometimes you might find these committees basically have, um, uh, the responsibilities for setting long-term business strategy and making certain changes within the organization in order to ensure that the business processes continue to support the overall strategies and the organization's overall requirements. So if you have effective governance, which is in fact enabled through the development of documented policies, standards, and requirements, and applicable metrics. So we'll take a look on what a policy infrastructure is and how it should be looking like, and how it kind of frames the organization's requirement in the next slide. So basically, as I have stated, when it comes to governance, a lot of factors needs to be considered from an organization's perspective. Like, for an example, you need to take a look on the goals and objectives of the organization, some of the legal requirements that the organization needs to be compliant with. As we always say that as an organization, you can think global, but you need to be always obeying your local legal requirements. Okay, so at the same time, you'll need to be considerate of the information security requirements that needs to be followed in, as you might be aware that a lot of attackers evolve over a period of time. Therefore, the capabilities with which they come up also evaluate over a period of time. So when you're defining the governance framework within the organization, you need to be aware of the security requirements as well. And one of the branches within the legal requirement which has taken a lot of significance, especially with the advent of rules like general data privacy regulations and CCPA California privacy requirements, etc. Around the world, you might find other rules as well governing the privacy requirements. So you'll find that the issues that the organization typically faces when it comes to managing their IT resources are driven by some of these factors. Okay, so basically, you might find that organizations integrate IT security and privacy governance into a single set of participants, activities, and business records. And the most important thing is that organizations figure out how to establish governance programs for achieving the formally established business objectives. So one of the key things that needs to be created in order to implement all these expectations and requirements is to establish what you call as a policy infrastructure. So within your policy infrastructure, you have policies, of course, and these policies are supported by what you would call as a standard. Then you will have some of the procedural document, and there will be certain guidances. Okay, now of these policies are especially going to talk you about from a high level requirement in order to implement the expectation of your governance. Like say for an example, it might say at a high level that all my systems should be hardened, all my servers should be hardened, all my passwords should be strong and secured. Okay, it will not go into the detail relative to hardening of a Windows system or hardening of a Linux system, etc. Now, the policy is something that needs to be established by the leadership within the organization, and these policies should be followed throughout the organizations. It is a mandatory requirement. Okay, so the requirements of policies are mandatory. Now, from an execution leadership perspective, you might find some of the CISOs and CIOs and CTOs within the organization. What they have to do is to take the expectations of these policies and establish a way of how to implement the policy in on the ground itself, right? So in order to implement the policy on the ground, you might need to establish certain standards. Now, what are called as the standards? So standards are something that allows you to have a consistent mechanism of implementing the expectations of the policies. Now, imagine that a policy at a high level says all my systems should be hardened. Okay. Now, it's an important requirement, but if you need to establish, operational perspective to this, you need to have basically a standardized set of infrastructure. Say, for an example, if you have Linux, if you have Mac systems, if you have Windows systems, then each of these needs to have the separate hardening requirements, rather than if you decide as an organization that as a standard, I'm only going to use Windows 10 as one of my preferred systems throughout the organization. It'll be easier for you to establish the or implement the requirements for the policies, right? So policy, the whole objective of establishing standards is to kind of ensure that throughout the organization you have a consistent technology specification, which will ease your a mechanism for basically implementing something or updating something or protecting something. Although it is easier said than done, uh, organization should be striving towards ensuring that they use standardized solutions throughout their organization in order to implement the expectations of the policies. Now, these standards should be supported with what you sometimes call as a procedure. Okay. Now, say for an example, when you have selected that you need to use say for an example Red Hat 8 or Red Hat 9 as one of the standardized system, all the set of servers throughout your organization. Then in order to implement that particular server, you need to be establishing a set of procedures, right? A documented procedures wherein you basically will have to state that um, Red Hat installation procedures should be this. These are the sequence of steps that are to be implemented: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or you can establish a flow chart in order to implement. Again, like your policies and standards, your procedures are also the mandatory requirements. So the whole objective of defining a particular procedure is to ensure that throughout the organization, everyone has a defined sequence of activities that are to be implemented for implementing the requirements within the standardized infrastructure that you have within the organization. So having procedures in place will allow you to have easier change of hands when someone leaves a role or someone new comes in, adapts to a new defined requirements, right? And then some of the guidances can also be published in order to have an easier way of implementing the standards and procedures. But these are optional requirements and some of the best practices. Like say for an example, if your policy has a requirement that all your passwords should be complex, then guideline might something state like you can use a passphrase which is known only to the user, and it's because passphrases are something which are unique to the user. It will be easy to implement the complex password, but again that is something a guideline which is not a mandatory requirement. So if you are within the organizations, if you are tasked with what you would call to establish or design a policy infrastructure right from the scratch, the organization leadership should be constantly educated on what are the industry best practices. So as an organization, you can take some of the cues from well-defined or particularly COVID-5 for an example. You can always leverage these well-designed frameworks in order to create a policy infrastructure for your organization. As they always say in the security domain or technology domain, that you may not have to always reinvent the wheel. So there is a lot of research work which has already been done. As an organization, as a leader within the organization, you can basically evaluate what's the expectations are. Some of these requirements relative to NIST or ISO 27001, etc., can be mandated throughout the legal requirements as well. And therefore you need to be aware of what are the applicable legal requirements and have them incorporated while designing the policy infrastructure. Okay. And again, policy is something which is internally defined, which is internally applicable. Therefore, it is always advised that you need to take advisory from the legal department within the organization in terms of what are the applicable laws that I need to be compliant with, what are the regulatory requirements. Sometimes you might be required to be compliant with some of the standards which are well known within the organization. Say, for an example, you might need to be compliant with the PCI DSS if you are handling credit card based transactions or card based transactions, etc. So those are some of the mandatory requirements. So those requirements needs to be incorporated within the policy whenever the policy is supposed to be kind of created. The whole objective of governance, risk, and compliance is driven by the fact that governance helps you design these policies. As an organization, you achieve compliance by meeting the requirements of the policies. And if you do not meet the requirements of the policies, you might intentionally or accidentally give rise to what you call as a risk. Okay. So what is something risk is something that will now understand. Okay. So before we understand the concepts of risk, you need to be understanding some of the basic principles of the CIA triad that we typically use as one of the governing principles of implementing the security. Like, say, for example, I stands for integrity, wherein the objective is to ensure that uh, the uh, the information that you have got is not altered or modified in an unauthorized manner, and availability ensures that you need to be kind of have these information available to those who have a requirement. All of these things can be achieved by different ways. For an example, you can achieve confidentiality by having a robust user access management solution. You can achieve it by having an appropriate encryption solution. You can achieve it by ensuring that you have an adequate vulnerability management solution, etc. Same way, integrity can be achieved by ensuring that you have a strong user access management solution wherein you define authorization levels so that those people who connect into the system cannot make an unauthorized change on top of it. And availability can be ensured by having resiliency as well as high availability requirements as well. Now, there are multiple different solutions that can be used to achieve the objectives of CIA. Okay. Um, uh, so basically, risk management is basically an exercise wherein you define an overall process of developing a strategy to address the risk that can be existing within the organization when there is non-compliance against the policy and a threat towards the confidentiality, integrity, or requirement. Okay. So basically, before we understand risk, you need to understand some of the definitions around risk and what are the different components of risk. Okay. So the first component that you should be knowing about is what you call as a threat. The simplest definition of a threat is a negative event. A negative event can be something like a malware attack that has impacted your organization, or say for an example, a COVID-19 where the organization's ability to operate has impacted, then maybe a flood or an earthquake or a natural hazard, etc., can be a negative event. A robbery can be a negative event. So any negative event will be typically classified as a threat, and it needs to be initiated by a threat agent. Like, say for an example, malware attack can be initiated by a hacker, and sometimes your threat agent can be unprepared, natural use cases, which can be an act of God as well. Apart from that, there is something called as a vulnerability, and the simplest definition to know about vulnerability is a weakness. Okay, weakness arises because you don't do something as expected by the policy. Like, say for an example, you haven't established standard operating procedures for implementing patch management solution, or you have not implemented, for a subset of systems, you have not implemented, privileged access management capabilities. You have established a training and awareness capability within your organization, but not all employees have completed it. So these are the weaknesses which are basically targeted by the threats in order to cause an impact. Okay, so basically, uh, these impacts will eventually release or create what you would call as a risk. Okay, so therefore, you need to understand the fact that risk is a combination of multiple different factors. You need to have the threats, you need to have the vulnerabilities, and there are two important parameters other than threats and vulnerabilities. Need to remember that threats and vulnerabilities are your static parameters. Uh, they exist, but the things that implement or influences the severity of a risk are actually driven by two of the dynamic parameters, which are your likelihood and impact. Okay, so likelihood can manifest itself in variety of ways. uh, Basically, likelihood can be measured in terms of the likelihood of a threat occurring or the negative event happening in the first place. Likelihood can also be evaluated in terms of how it is going to successfully cause an impact as well, right? So likewise, your impact can also increase or decrease depending upon the controls that you have currently in place as well. Overall, in order to realize a risk, you need to have all these four parameters in order to come up to a substantial conclusion towards a risk. Okay. One thing that you need to be understanding is, in order to cause a risk, you need to have both threat and vulnerabilities. Okay, so risk will not exist if only one of these two components exists. So you might have a threat of malware attack targeted towards DNS servers, but if you do not have a DNS servers within your organization, then you might not be, you might not be exposed towards that particular risk area. Okay, so so the only thing that you need to remember is risk is something that is created when you basically have all of these four different parameters operating together. All right. So managing risk is a complex exercise, and it basically follows four major phases. First phase is basically about identifying or detecting a risk. It's a continuous exercise. I mean, in all, the life cycle is not something that should be static. It should be going on a day in and out basis, because your threats evolve, your vulnerabilities evolve, therefore your risks evolve. So you need to be kind of continuously, performing this exercise. In the first phase, you need to be identifying what are your threats, what are your vulnerabilities, what are the applicable risks that you might be kind of facing in the risk assessment phase. You do an impact and likelihood analysis, wherein you identify the dynamic parameters that can be associated with the static values of threats and vulnerabilities. In the next phase of risk treatment or response, you need to be analyzing what current compensating controls are there, what new controls need to be brought in, and um, what are the targeted requirements in terms of the security posture or the risk profile that we are targeting to achieve. And in the final phase, you need to be ensuring that the controls that you have implemented in order to address this particular risk that you have identified is actually delivering its expected requirements. Okay. Now, this is a continuous cycle, as I have stated, but you need to be ensuring that these things are appropriately addressed. Okay, so we'll take a look on each of these different phases which are applicable for managing the risk within the organization in the subsequent slide. But before we get in there, we need to be understanding about some of the terminologies relative to the risk capacity, appetite, and tolerance. All right. So risk capacity is something which is the maximum amount of risk that the organization um, can basically adapt or absorb. Whereas risk appetite is the acceptable amount of risk that the organization can absorb. Okay. And depending upon the situation or depending upon the requirements, an organization can increase its appetite by a factor of, say, X percentage. Uh, but it would not be always the case. And the amount of variance that you can have from your risk appetite is what defines your risk tolerance levels. Okay, so this is something that the organization's leadership has to be figuring out. They need to understand like what their risk appetite is. Uh, if you are in a banking organization, you might be a risk averse organization, so you might have a extremely lower risk appetite. Therefore, you need to have a higher degree of controls in order to keep your risk levels at a minimum level as possible. Whereas if you are a risk aggressive organization, you might have a higher risk appetite and you might have lower number of controls and investment done towards control requirements, and therefore you might have what you call um, a higher risk appetite. So as an organization, as a leader, you need to be doing a careful analysis in terms of what's the cost you have that you can leverage towards, implementing controls or implementing solutions towards addressing risk, uh, and whether you have that much of appetite in terms of absorbing that particular risk. Okay, and you need to be also be considerate about what happens if my appetite is low or high. So if my appetite is high, am I having the required capabilities? Or if I'm having a risk appetite of low, am I be able to bear the consequences of non-complying with certain legal requirements in terms of the financial penalties, etc. So it's a calculated decision. It needs to be considerate of advisory from the legal departments, from the technology department, from the finance departments, and it's a comprehensive exercise that goes towards the definitions of what the risk appetite of an organization should be, and it drives how you approach your overall risk management life cycle. Okay, so let's now understand, the first phase and what exactly happens in the first phase. So, as I have stated, risk management is a sequence of exercises. First phase begins with risk identification. So basically, the objective here is to create a list of what you would call as a risk scenarios. And in order to understand the risk scenarios, uh, you know, um, you need to be aware of certain parameters that should be um, uh, understood. So one of the first things that you must try and do is to identify risk. You must first identify all the components of the risk that are existing within the organization. So in order to develop these risk scenarios, you need to identify what are your threats, what are your vulnerabilities, what are your assets. Okay, and basically, to acquire knowledge of all these different elements, you need to perform an in-depth assessment in order to have you this information. Okay. For an example, you'll need to inventory all of your assets. Now, what are assets? Assets are something that has a value to the organization, right? It can be your market reputation, it can be your facilities that you have within the organization, it can be your data centers, it can be your servers within the data centers, or the platforms installed in terms of the in the servers, or the end user softwares installed on the endpoint laptops. So all of these needs to be inventory, okay? And each of the component within the inventory, or the inventory of your asset, needs to be categorized based on the criticality and the priority of that particular asset to the particular organization. Okay. So basically, the value indicates how much they are worth to your organization. Okay. Now, this could be in terms of the dollars to replace that particular asset, or in terms of how much revenue that your organization will be losing out if that particular asset is lost. So the priority could be in reference to the relative criticality of the asset to the organization, which could indicate how much protection that the organization believes an asset warrants, and the urgency of protecting or restoring that asset or the capability it is providing in case it is lost. Although the terms value, priority, criticality, and urgency may all seems to be confusing, they are all interrelated terms that the organization must define for each of its assets. Okay. So, for instance, assets that are deemed critical will likely have a higher value to the organization, as well as a higher priority in the order of restoration if that asset is particularly lost or damaged, for an example. There's a related term called as an exposure factor, which will be describing the level of loss an asset could suffer. We'll discuss a lot about exposure factor when we discuss about the quantitative risk assessment in one of the next few slides. Okay. So basically, in addition to identifying what your assets are, you need to be also understanding what your threats are. So in order to do a threat, basically, or identify the threats that are applicable to the organization, you need to create what you would call as a threat assessment. Now it is different models which are going to help you to do a proactive threat assessment, like stride, for an example, which is the abbreviation developed by Microsoft in terms of spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, elevation of threats, etc. Likewise, there are multiple other models as well which can help you to understand what your threats are. The easiest way is to take your asset, decompose that particular asset, and understand, decompose it to the granular level as possible, understand what each individual component of that particular asset is made up of in terms of what technology that is being built with, or what solution it is having, what are the areas that it kind of supporting, etc. And take each of these granular component and understand like what value it will be providing to a threat agent, what capability that the threat agent needs to have in order to exploit this particular entity or this particular decomposed components within my asset, what will be the motivation that the threat agent have in terms of compromising this particular component in there, and in terms of what are the tools and technologies needed to decompose this particular asset, and what are the current controls that I have in terms of my existing control posture around protecting this particular component. So at the end of this exercise, you'll have a list of negative events that could be targeted on each of these components, and you can rank them in terms of the severity of the impact it might create, depending upon the applicable exposure that it will be having it. Okay. Likewise, you can do a vulnerability assessment, as I have stated that vulnerabilities is a weakness. Okay. It can be a technical weakness, or it can be an administrative weakness. So technical weaknesses can be discovered by doing assessments on a periodic basis. Some organizations take all of their IT assets, install them with an agent, periodically do a scan and identify if there is a weakness within it, or a malware that has impacted. Okay. Similarly, administrative weaknesses can be in terms of the lack of policies, lack of procedures, lack of governing monitoring capabilities, lack of indicators, etc., to monitor whether the controls are performing appropriately. So you need to be understanding or doing this assessment on a periodic basis and identifying these administrative weaknesses as well. Some of the physical controls that are applied in your facilities might not be operating. Some of them might not be checked for a longer period of time. Some of the fire recovery systems in your data centers might not have been tested, or the power backups might not have been tested on a periodic basis as required. So all of these weaknesses should be identified. Okay. So after you identify the negative events, after you identify your weaknesses, you need to be kind of merging these two different entities together, and identify what you would call as a threat vulnerability pair. Okay, as I have stated, threats and vulnerabilities needs to exist in pair in order to cause a risk. If they exist in silo, it will not cause a risk. Okay, so all of them needs to be tied back, and all these information that you have collected as a part of your risk identification exercise, you need to be creating a risk scenario. So your risk identification exercise is basically driven towards ensuring that you have a list of risk scenarios, which is having a component of threat agent, threat vulnerabilities, applicable assets on top of which it could be targeted, and some of the other auxiliary parameters like time and location, where the exploit of vulnerability by a threat initiated by a threat agent may be more pronounced. So you need to be creating a list of risk scenarios, and on the basis of this created list of risk scenarios, you can apply what you would call as the applicable the likelihood and impact analysis, which we'll be discussing in a short while from now. So this is the first phase wherein you will be creating a risk identification exercise. Now, the risk scenario development can be a complex exercise, and uh, you may basically create a list of risk scenarios and prune it down by mapping it with the business objectives, or you can start with the business objectives and identify the risk scenarios as applicable or tied to each business scenario. So to identify these risk scenarios, the organization must first look at its business, must look at its vision, must look at its mission, and determine what type of risk could impact the achievement of the goals of that particular mission. Okay. So as an organization, it would then generate risk scenarios to account for all the possible negative events that could happen or apply to that particular organization, which might also develop a more detailed risk scenario that could affect particular business objectives or units. So in order to appropriately identify risk scenarios, the organization must collect and assimilate the data on business's operational environment, which can be both internal and external, as well as the different potential risk events that may happen and the factors which might be contributing to them, right? Additionally, as we discussed before as well, gaining information on the possible threat agents, threat vectors, assets, and vulnerabilities is also a necessary step in developing your risk scenarios. Now, both the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach for development of these risk scenarios can have their advantages and disadvantages. Like for an example, in the top-down approach, is that the scenarios developed basically target relevant business objectives. Disadvantage is that it is narrowly focused and might not consider all the potential risk scenarios, especially the unrelated ones. Whereas the bottom-up approach, on the other hand, can consider all the different types of possible scenarios, even the ones that might not be developed through a conventional thought, by tying it with the business objectives. The disadvantage of this approach, however, is that the risk scenario developed may be too large and might not have in terms of the likelihood causing them to be very difficult to kind of manage and maintain. Additionally, it might take a lot of work to reduce the number of relevant likely risk scenarios to a manageable level, and that is something that needs to be kept in mind as well. In order to develop these risk scenarios, right, you might need to collect a lot of information in this exercise, and And as a risk practitioner, as an auditor, one of the key challenges that you will be facing is collecting and managing all the data that you might be requiring for your assessments. So on one end of the spectrum, you might have a significant amount of data. Some of them might not be relevant, and in use cases, you might not find the bare minimum amount of data as well. So basically, the other challenge that you might have to deal with is the source of the data. Okay. While the best data comes from authoritative sources that have expertise in various areas, such as the asset or the system in the question, current threats, current vulnerabilities, as a risk practitioner, as an auditor, you have to be able to separate the fact from the opinion and collect what you would call as a truly objective data from a large amount of non-applicable subjective data. So objective data is the evidence that supports an assertion about an asset or a particular risk, which can be proved or verified, through an independent mechanism. Whereas the subjective data is the data whose validation is to kind of, subject to someone's opinion. For an example, as an auditor, I look at the system logs, which kind of provides me an objective data in form of the audit logs that detail the events that had happened on a particular system and trace those events back to the individual, and thereby I can validate the accountability. Okay. So depending upon the type of the information that you would be needing, there are different ways of collecting that particular information. So first and foremost, that you can always start up with is the interviews. One of the best methods to start collection of data is to talk to the people, the system owners, the asset owners, the administrators, security people, etc. So it should be targeted with some of the key people who are managing that particular process, posture or procedures, etc. So you need to carefully record your interview results through meeting notes or say session recording, etc. And you need to be aware that interview that you are conducting is collecting the data that should be subjective in nature. It can be used as a starting point to gather knowledge and facts about a system that can be later verified using other means. Okay. Now, interviews, after you have done your interviews, you can collect certain documented evidence. Now, it is one of the most important aspects that you need to be collecting as a part of your risk assessments. As we say in the world of our audit, that if you're not documenting it, then you are not doing it, right? Some of the documentation can be paper-based, some of the documentation can be in the electronic form, in spreadsheets, etc. So all of your documentation should be carefully validated against the time and the date in which it was reviewed and it was created, and understood that it has been subjected to the periodic reviews, and you are only collecting the latest document that is applicable. From there, you move on to the system observation and verification. Sometimes it is not enough to interview or talk to the people and review the documentation. Unfortunately, people can lie or be mistaken in the interviews, and documentation can be falsified. Observing a system in operation can verify whether it is, kind of secure, and whether its security functions and controls are actually working as intended to protect the systems and the data as applicable. And the same is true for your physical security controls as well. So basically, the last thing that you could do, and it is one of the most strongest mechanism of document collection, is to kind of test the systems. So sometimes you can request read-only access to the systems that you are reviewing or doing against an assessment of. It might require some of the technical skills in terms of looking for data relative to the patches that are installed, active vulnerabilities which are sitting or resident on the systems, the unauthorized user accounts which are created, some of the corrupted configuration files, registry settings, and other technical data. So by doing this, you can have the most authoritative and the objective assessment around the assets that you are kind of having in. You can also request the overall asset inventory that the organization has in place in terms of what are the different types of asset, as asset is one of the significant component that you might have in terms of what your risk identification criteria. And likewise, you can always have the threat and vulnerability identification as well, in terms of the assessment reports that are being done by the relevant applicable teams in terms of what are the applicable threats and the vulnerabilities. So you can always take all those information, merge them together, and create what you would call as a comprehensive set of or a sequence of risk scenarios as applicable by your organization. Okay, so the next phase, from where after completion of your risk identification exercise, you move on to your risk assessment exercise. So, so basically, the term assessment is something which might be confusing for certain instances. So basically, an assessment refers to an overall combination of steps, including the ones that you have taken in while identification of risk scenarios and adding them with what you would call as evaluation and analysis. Okay. So identification involves analysis or identification of the assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, and your existing controls. That is important. Risk evaluation focuses on identifying the likelihood and impact, which are your dynamic variables in the risk calculations. If the vulnerabilities are exploited by a threat and causing a damage to a particular asset. So risk analysis is actually informing the organization about the real risk that is applicable by considering your existing controls and their behavior and the gaps that they kind of create in terms of what is the desired state versus what is the current state that you might be applying for. Okay, so the key exercises that you undergo or to evaluate under the risk assessment exercise is your analysis of the risk factors. So it is important that you understand what are these risk factors. So as we stated, the threat and vulnerabilities are static parameters, likelihood and impact are dynamic parameters, and these dynamic parameters can be adjusted up and down, and risk factors are the factors which affect or influences the level of risk by uh, creating or reducing risk by influencing your likelihood and impact. Okay, they can also influence your threat and vulnerabilities as well. So basically in many different ways. Uh, so basically these factors can affect the organization's ability to reduce or mitigate a particular risk. So, while risk factors are not necessarily the same thing as threats and vulnerabilities, impact, or likelihood, they can influence them in unpredictable manners. So, some of them can be environmental in nature, can come in from the organization's operating environment. Some of them can be inherently internal to the organization, as well as some of them can be an external risk factor as well. Some factors actually come from the nature of this organization, the type of the businesses they are in, their size of the organization, their missions, the geography wherein they operate, their financial posture, their market reputation, etc. These factors will be affecting risk because they also in turn affect the ability of the business to function. Some of the internal factors or the risk factors that can be associated, influencing the risk, for an example, include the org structure. A more complex org structure within the organization can have difficulties in getting solutions implemented. The ethical behaviors that are driven through the organization culture, right? So apart from that, the people within the organization. So the people of the organization include not only its employees and the managers, but also anyone who has a stake in the success of the organization as well. So the external factors would be including your applicable legal compliance requirements or the contractual obligations from the standards that are mandated. Some of the natural consequences, environmental parameters might include where you're doing businesses, where the applicable economic landscape, your market in that particular environment, your competitors. All these factors can influence the applicability of the risk to your organization. So these assessments can be done using two different approaches. One is a quantitative approach, basically which uses concrete, non-subjective numerical values and statistical analysis to calculate the likelihood and impact of the risk. So basically, it follows the same general pattern that we discussed. Basically, you must first identify your assets along with the replacement costs and exposure factors, calculate the impact of the full or partial loss of the asset, and determine the likelihood of a negative event and come up with the overall risk to the organization. It might be calculated in terms of dollar, for example. So let's take a scenario and understand like how this particular quantitative risk assessment pans out through an example. Okay. Let's imagine that you are an employee. You have been selected by a small family-owned business that has no other security employees employed. You've been tasked with developing a risk management strategy and program for that particular business. Now, suppose that business is a small server farm which is located in a in an older building. Okay. Uh, in within this campus and has wooden walls, older wiring, no backup electrical power, but a reasonable good fire detection and suppression system. Now, this server farm, imagine, has got 4 different servers, each performing a specific data processing function. Now, this data is backed up weekly, but it takes time to restore, and there is a good likelihood that some of the data would be lost because of the weekly backup schedule. Now, let's also say, just for the sake of illustration, that each of these servers are costing you around $10,000 to replace with a new server. Okay. Uh, Basically, you have attempted to quantify the factors for your owners, such as recovery time objective and recovery point objective, by doing a business impact assessment. These factors will tell you how much data you could afford to lose if a disaster has happened, such as a fire burning down that particular building, and how fast you would need to recover the data in order to resume the operations of the business in order to avoid suffering a significant loss of business. So now let's assume that small business is located in an area prone to what you would call as a thunderstorm, okay, where lightning strikes the metal roof of the building and one of the servers suffers a power surge that completely renders it inoperable. So if after such an event, an assessment determines that the server cannot be repaired, you need to buy another one, and the replacement cost is around $10,000. So let's do some calculations around this particular scenario. So here in this case, the value of your asset is $10,000. Your exposure factor is 1 or 100%. Uh, Basically, it's always written in terms of the percentages. So 100 by 100 is 1. So single expectancy loss, which is the loss in case of a single risk event being realized, which is calculated by multiplying your asset value with the exposure factor, which in this case will be $10,000. So with an exposure, single loss expectancy of around $10,000, um, you will have to ensure or believe that the scenario never happens. However, based upon analysis of historical weather patterns in the area and given the construction and limited electrical protections of the building the server farm sits with, this seems like the possibility. So you would determine how much the organization is likely to lose per year on such a scenario. So you need to calculate, in order to calculate this, you need to know a couple of other information. First, you need to know how often to expect a severe storm in areas. Now, from the meteorological department, say, you know that on an annual basis, it happens, say, 15 times a year. So basically, your annualized rate of occurrence will be 15. So on an annual basis, you need to be kind of multiplying this single loss expectancy 15 times and might come up with a value of $150,000. Obviously, this is a bit of stretch because even if there are 15 severe lightning producing storms per year, it is not likely that each and every one would be producing a lightning strike on the server building every time. Even if that could happen, it is likely that after it happens for the first time, the business owners would invest in a new facility or relocate its servers by reducing the possibilities of other events. So you might do some statistical analysis to find out what really is the likelihood of one or more of these events, 15 thunder striking causing the lightning strike on the building. So that analysis might bring down the annualized rate of occurrence from 15 to say 3 for an example. So you might be having, like, in one instance you lose $10,000, therefore multiply that with 3 and you might lose at max $30,000. Okay. You'll have to keep in mind that in this analysis that we have done is the potential risk for the organization, which is expressed in terms of the lost revenue, in terms of the revenue and the assets. So we haven't, this scenario is a very simplistic scenarios. We haven't considered other use cases. For an example, if the business starts to lose $1,000 per day in revenue for every server that is out of availability, which we did not take into account. Okay, this consideration is not only related to single loss expectancy value, but also influences the recovery time objective and recovery point objective as well. So again, it might be possible with that a total loss of server might not happen. So it might be only a 40% loss, which will be reducing your exposure factor to 0.4. So you must take all of these into account when performing a quantitative risk analysis. Okay. There are multiple other factors which can be in terms of the depreciation of the asset, lost labor hours to repair or replace that server. So there could be multiple factors, but the basics are basically about understanding what your assets are, understanding what the values are, what is the exposure factor, what is the percentage of the asset value that will be lost in case of an exposure, what is the cost of a single loss, what, how many times within a year you are expecting that particular negative event to happen, and then calculate what you would call as an annualized loss expectancy. Sometimes after this, you might need to do a cost benefit analysis, because you might not need to spend 20 rupees for fixing something which is the value of that particular asset is 5 rupees. So if your solution that you are bringing in to reduce that particular risk is expensive, then that cost benefit analysis needs to be also done and merged with the risk appetite of the organization in order to address that. So that's how you would take a quantitative approach to perform a risk assessment, for an example. There's an alternative subjective way of doing this assessment as well, wherein you will take the list of risk scenarios that you have created in the initial phase of risk identification, subject them to, or kind of provide them to the subject matter experts and business process owners, ask them to kind of, provide a value, in a scale of 1 to 5 for likelihood and impact, and take those inputs, put them into a table, take an average, and identify, say, for example, this scenario, one has a likelihood of 2, considering the different capabilities in place, and may have a consequences of 4. So you can put them in a table like this, for an example, and come up with the risk applicable, which in this case will be a moderate risk. So objective is to understand, there can be a questionnaire based approach, there can be a checklist based approach, there can be a more subjective based approach, there can be document information collected from the interview and understood in terms of what could be a subjective values of the risk. There are different values of risk which cannot be quantified. For an example, the market reputation, the consumer confidence, the economic impacts in terms of the business loss that you might be suffering in terms of this particular being realized. Say, for an example, Marriott hotels, for an example, when they were recently subjected to a data breach, they had lost a significant chunk of their customers in their market space. So these things cannot be quantified and can be only assessed using a qualitative approach. So as a risk practitioner, as an auditor, I would rather say that you need to use a combination of both qualitative and quantitative approach, and use the best of both worlds when you are coming up with what you would call as a risk value against your organization. So the so up until now we were discussing about a lot of risk scenario development. We were discussing about the likelihood and impact. So one of the key things that organizations use throughout the world in the risk management practice is what you would call as a risk register. So risk register is a living document. It's constantly updated with the evolving risk profile of an organization. So you need to be kind of having a risk register wherein you will be documenting all of your risks, who is the risk owners, what are the sources of that particular risk, what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities, etc. You need to be also kind of putting them in a category of high risk or low, and we need to be also mapping against the risk appetite of the organization relative to that particular asset. Okay, so you need to calculate the inherent risk. You need the objective of inherent risk is the risk without considering existing controls that you have in place. The plain and simple risk without considering the in existing controls within the organization. Okay, so after that, after identifying the inherent risk, you need to take a look at the current controls. Who are the current control owners? Go and talk to them, identify basically whether those controls are effective, whether the controls have gap between the current state and the desired state. So after that, you need to change these values of likelihood and impact into a more relatable value and revise this risk rating and understand if it is within the risk appetite of the organization. If the risk is something that could be accepted or absorbed, is it acceptable to the organization? So if it is not acceptable, then you need to be coming up with a treatment action plan, which we'll be discussing in terms of the next slide in terms of how to develop one. But the objective will be to create a list of actions, identify the action owners, due date, and what would be the residual risk after the new controls are brought in place, and whether the residual risk is within the risk appetite. So all these information should be documented inside the risk register and should be periodically tracked and ensure that none of the risks which are outside of your risk appetite slips through the cracks. Okay. So it's a living document. It should be constantly updated in order to be kind of kept in line with the evolving risk profile of your organization. Right. So as I have stated, this phase of risk treatment begins after you have considered the current controls. So your current controls and whether they are effective in addressing the risk scenario that you have in your hand is extremely important to be kind of understood in terms of what needs to be done. Okay. So moving on, having developed your understanding of your risk, you should also develop an understanding of the corresponding risk response options. Okay, so these options might be able to bring your risk levels down from to a risk level, to a level which is acceptable to your organization, which is within the risk appetite. So the different options that are available as an organization, you can decide to bring in new controls and new solutions, new capabilities in order to reduce the risk and bring it within the risk appetite of the organization. You can accept the risk. Basically, in this case, you take the risk, you have performed the cost benefit analysis, you have considered alternatives, and after analysis is done, you have decided that I will not take any action and continue with the operations with the risk. Okay. Whereas risk avoidance is an exercise wherein you did the cost benefit analysis and you felt that the alternatives are something which is not financially feasible, which is not financially prudent. Therefore, you decide to stop that process together. So there is a difference between risk acceptance and avoidance. Under risk acceptance, you decide to continue the operations with the risk by documenting the fact that yes, I am accepting the risk and I am ready for the consequence. Whereas in risk avoidance, you basically decide that you are not going to continue with the process. There are no actions that to be taken and the process should be scrapped altogether. Okay. And the last one is the risk transfer, wherein you basically bring in or rely on external partners who will be assuming the risk on your behalf. Say, for an example, you purchase an insurance, cyber insurance. So basically, these organizations are capable of, understanding what the risks are. They will be buying the risk on your behalf. So next time when the ransomware attack happens, they will be taking the financial impact associated with it. But it is important to understand that you can only transfer the financial impact, but the qualitative parameters like reputation and all, something which cannot be transferred in terms of the risk transfer option. Okay, these are the different choices that you have in terms of treatment of a risk that you are provided with. All right. The next case is in while selection of these risk responses, you might be considerate of various parameters. Okay, so selecting a risk response entails more than just blind luck or good fortune. In selection of the risk response, you should consider all of the factors uh, that needs to be considered in terms of the cost of both the response and the potential cost of not responding, the context of the organization and associated risk appetite, and simple ease of implementation. So there are different parameters that needs to be considered. First one is the cost. Cost is obviously a large factor in the response determination. When you think about cost, think about not only the financial impact of any decision, but also the less easily quantified aspects like the goodwill or the brand status, hard to define attributes. You need to consider the cost to maintain the responsive action over a required lifespan as well. What are the maintenance costs that are associated with the solution? Okay. For example, if you require to apply an expensive IT solutions into your architecture to load balance and you don't have the IT professionals who are skilled or knowledgeable in that particular area, you might be required to hire a new professional or train an existing staff member. That also brings up your ability to plan for contingencies. If one person enough, um, is one person enough to kind of address that particular risk? Does he have the required skills? Do you need more resources? So basically a lot of things are supposed to be considered as well. Following cost, you need to be able to understand the capabilities as well for the organization to implement the response, which should also be considered. How mature is your company's ability to implement that particular response? Do you have a small and an untrained ad hoc team? In that case, the most sophisticated measure might not be an appropriate one. Perhaps you need a new team. Uh, in contrast, a sharp, well-trained, experienced team can handle a more complicated mitigation measure and a process as well. The third parameter that you should be looking is how effective they are. So effectiveness can be measured as the extent to which the response reduces the likelihood or impact of the risk given to the organization, right? If the effectiveness of the response activity is in question, that's a strong reason to consider the path questionable as well. And finally, if the efficiency is a requirement, you need to be ensuring that the solution or the treatment plan that you are approaching, it should be able for to cover more objectives, more than one objectives that are set in front of them. Quite simply, if a solution that are more efficient is if they lower the risk, then if they lower the risk for more than one risk, particularly for an example. So in an ideal scenario, you should look for a low cost, high effective solution, uh, but you would hardly find them. Therefore, you need to be considering about other options as well. And in the next slide, we'll discuss around how to kind of make a pitch or a business case to your leadership in terms of what solutions have to be implemented. But all these parameters needs to be considered while developing your risk treatment strategy for the organization. So basically, we know about what the risk response options are, what are the parameters that should be considered. Having stated that, we now need to identify what areas within risk needs to be prioritized and which ones should be fixed first. Okay, there are three use cases. You can go with a quick win, you can go with a business case, which can go with a deferral options. So quick wins are just that. So they meet the criteria and address the medium to high risk, and they look always going to um, they look good doing that. So for an example, if you have to use an existing firewall rule to address a new risk without making much modification, that could be a good solution. If you are bringing in a new administrative policy in order to kind of bring some restriction in terms of how the device or system should operate, it's a quick way. But not all solutions are quick wins. You might need to be bringing in new solutions, purchasing new solutions. For those use cases, you might need to have a business case. The business case for a particular risk response must be made if the response cannot be quickly or easily implemented without a significant cost or change to the organization to the system. So, in contrast, making a business case is much more difficult than pitching a quick win. A business case for a particular response must be made in the response which cannot be quickly or easily implemented without a significant, cost or change to the organization or the system. So these changes might include processes, infrastructure, architecture, or design, and they are significant enough to warrant a business case in order to respond to that particular risk. So a business case for a risk response justifies the expense and the work required to make that particular response function properly. So when you make a business case for a risk response, you must take a number of factors into account. Like, so what projects are currently in the pipeline? So is there something that would be conflicting with your proposed response option? Will it be making it irrelevant or making it more expensive? How is the overall business doing? If the bottom line is weak, it will be harder to sell any risk response solution which is expensive, even if it would be significantly improving the baseline level of risk. So whenever a business case is required to be made, generally the risk response option is more um, uh, expensive or more costly in terms of financial or personal resources will be the least one that will be selected. So it might also be attempting to address a low or a medium risk that does not have the attention of the leadership in the way risk would. So even an efficient and effective response to a low risk must be questioned and prioritized appropriately. Finally, you choose to defer, when um, a deferral is like the polar opposite of a quick win, whereas a quick win is almost obvious to get selected. A deferral is something that will always be rejected. So it will be at the bottom of the list. So we choose to accept the risk, uh, perhaps until the cost is reduced, or choose risk acceptance, which is a permanent measure. Okay. So so on the basis of this, you need to be bringing in certain controls. Now, these controls can be classified in different ways. Like you can classify them as a preventative solution, which is the objective is to stop a risk event from happening. A deterrent solution, which will be to discourage the threat agent or threat event from happening. A detective solution is designed with an objective to identify and report a particular risk, whereas a corrective solution is more about fixing the thing that is broken, and a compensating control is designed to address the weaknesses in any of the other four controls. While the preventive and deterrent controls are considered a safeguard, they are basically targeting the risk before it is happening, whereas detective and corrective controls are more countermeasures. They are, not proactive but reactive in nature. So in an ideal world, you should be trying to have as many as safeguards as possible in terms of your risk treatment options, in terms of the compared with the countermeasures that you will be bringing in. Even within preventive and deterrent, I would ideally suggest that you give a preference to the preventative controls over the deterrent controls, as they are the ones which will be stopping the risk event in the first places. This can be implemented in an automated manner or using manual intervention, and they can be implemented as physical, technical, or administrative control as well. So the risk and control ownership is something that needs to be considered as well. So now that you have decided what the solutions are, there are different ways that needs to be implemented in order to ensure that the controls are delivering the required objective. Okay. So within so basically, suppose you have a server X, and it has running an application, say for an example, the PeopleSoft, which is your ERP application. And this PeopleSoft is used by the finance department for financial reporting and general ledger, etc. And these finance departments basically uh, goes all the way towards providing the uh, quarterly guidance in terms of how the organization is doing to the stock exchange on a periodic basis. So as you can see, there are multiple parameters. Now this server is behind, say for an example, a firewall, and is connected to a network switch. Okay. So as you can see, there are different components involved over here. So uh, there is the organization board of directors who are responsible or accountable for quarterly financial updates. There is the chief financial officer who heads the financial department. Then there is this uh, then there is this hosting team director, basically who hosts these Windows servers. Then there is this PeopleSoft application owner, uh, and then there is this network of firewall team owner, which is an infrastructure department head, for an example. So whenever a risk is identified, in say for an example on the firewall rule that guards this, or a risk is identified in the server configuration, a risk is identified in the code of that particular application. So it is important that it needs to be fixed. Therefore, um, risk ownership should be tied at multiple layers. Okay, so the source from where that particular risk has emanated from until the leadership within the organization. It is always stated that the organizational leaders are eventually accountable no matter what is the type of the risk that the organization is facing in, because they are the ones who are accountable to the stakeholders, to their customers, towards their legal on law enforcement authorities, etc. So when you're defining a risk treatment solution, it is extremely important that you identify who is the risk owner and allocate the control owners for each of the risk control that is supposed to be implemented or addressing this risk. So this allows you to ensure that the treatment options are streamlined and are implemented in a coordinated manner, and you are available that if this thing has happened, who are the relevant parties that needs to be brought in and correlated with what needs to be the section of solutions that needs to be applied. Okay, so there could be a risk owner, there could be a system owner, there could be an application owner, there could be a control owner. Understand, document, identify everything in your risk register so that you can easily implement the risk solutions that you have selected for your organization. There are different risk and control reporting techniques as well. So reporting of the risk and controls might use different various techniques to convey the data in a clear, accurate, and complete manner. So basically, some of them use this chart-based approach to kind of tell you about what is the risk level, what is the controls performance level, whether they are operating within the required framework within which they are designed to. Some of them use also the risk scorecards, basically using so this is the risk area, this is the impact, this is the likelihood, this is the residual score, this is the residual score last year, this is the residual score this year, these are the controls which are implemented, these are the expected outcomes that they are delivering, and on the basis of that you can always use this for reporting your risk to your leadership. So the leadership within the organization take a look on these values and parameters and come up with what should be the residual risk and whether they should be concerned about it. So one of the key things as a part of the governance exercise, as we discussed before as well, is about definition of indicators. These indicators will tell you about how your controls are performing. These controls will tell you whether there is a risk which is approaching, or whether there is a risk which is already approached, or whether the risk profile within the organization has changed. In the same way, whether they can also tell you whether the controls are effective. So these indicators should be specific, and it should be specific to the risk against which they are designed. They should be measurable, it should be objective, it should be attainable. It should not be unrealistic. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of uh, easy to expect 100% uptime, but it is unrealistic. It should be something attainable, and 99% uptime is something which is attainable. It should be relevant to the business processes, relevant to the areas of your organization, and should be available to you in a timely manner as and when you will need it. Okay, so you can define your indicators in something like this. An example has been given out here in terms of what is the strategic goal that is targeting, how you're going to measure it, what is the type, whether it will be targeting the effectiveness or efficiency or any other parameter. There should be a defined formula. What are the targeted systems that or what is the targeted level that you should be looking after, because it should be attainable. What are the sets of evidences that you need to be collecting it, how frequently you should be collecting it, who are the responsible parties, what are the sources of the data, how are you going to report it. So all these things should be defined and documented, and it should be used on a periodic basis in terms of uh, you know uh, in terms of understanding how your controls are performing. So this is an example for an availability measure. You can define certain metrics for every of the risk treatment mechanisms that you have brought in place as well. The next area that we'll now just discuss is about what are these emerging technologies and how they present risk to the organization. This is a use case or a business case. So newer emerging technologies can always present risk to the organization simply because there are several different important considerations when integrating these latest technologies into the infrastructure. So many organizations have this unfortunate, tendency to rush out, buy out, and attempt and implement the latest and greatest technologies on the market without, paying careful planning or considerations of the existing infrastructure and how it will be reacting to the newer technologies. So one of the primary considerations one must look at as an organization is about making a business case for the newer technology, which may be to kind of fill a gap that the older technology does not, provide, or a capability an organization must have to kind of compete with the market space. So basically, the company must really justify new technologies to make them worth the risk that they would be kind of bringing in. So let's understand some of the risk factors that they will be kind of bringing in along with themselves. So these are like, say, for an example, you're bringing in an IoT appliance based organizations to your organization, like smart lights. So there can be multiple emerging technologies like this as well, which are driven through artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. So emerging technologies have several risk factors which are inherent to their integration to their existing infrastructure. If the organization has been able to justify the implementation based on a true business need for the emerging technology, it must be considerate of the risk factors. And one of them, major ones, is the interoperability with the existing infrastructure. So frequently, newer technologies do not always work properly with the older systems right out of the box. So there might be some of the adjustments that need to be made to the existing infrastructure to integrate the new technology or to bridge new technologies, might be connecting the two. So interoperability doesn't just involve the right connections, it can involve data formats and flows, security methods and interfaces into other systems. Now, these considerations and many others are the risk factors that must be taken into account before, acquiring and integrating these new technologies. There is another risk factor which is in terms of, security. So new technologies may have the security mechanisms that are not necessarily backward compatible with the existing ones as well. Okay, examples include encryption algorithms and strength identification and authentication capabilities with the new systems, integrity mechanisms, redundant or backup systems, etc. So additionally, the systems might involve a learning curve that may intimidate new users who must now learn the security methods for these systems. Human factor can always be a weak link in the security chain. So either a lack of a training or a lack of an adaptability to the new security mechanisms can definitely introduce risk. So these are some of these things that needs to be kept in mind as well. And uh, and while designing or identifying these risk factors, you need to be identifying what are the threats these are bringing in, what are the vulnerabilities these are bringing in, what are the assets that they might be impacting, and the overall, the risk to the organizations that would be kind of applied or applicable. All right. So basically, one of the things that you need to understand that as an auditor, sometimes you might also be doing a risk assessment before you go and start with an audit. Okay. So basically, in the context of an audit, risk analysis is an activity that is going to determine the areas which would warrant some of the additional examination and analysis. In the absence of a risk analysis, an auditor will likely follow his or her gut instinct or apply additional security in areas where the risks are higher. So an auditor's risk assessment might be slightly different from an IT management's risk assessment. So, so basically, the perspective of an auditor is more objective, whereas the IT department will be more subjective in nature, while the focus of the risk assessment is on all the areas of potential risk that might be applicable to the organization, whereas the IT management should be kind of targeting certain existing controls for which they are accountable for. If there is a high risk area which is identified in a control, then an auditor you would like to kind of apply certain more controls, or control more scrutinizations during the audit, whereas an IT management might decide to accept it and continue operating it. If you identify a risk in without any existing control, you might, as an auditor, you might do an additional scrutinization, identify creation of a control as a recommendation, and as an IT management, you might basically be focusing. So the objectives are different, but the way you approach is what we just discussed extensively over the last 1.5 hours, is around how to identify the risk and then um, assess the risk, then treat the risk, and then monitor the risk. These are the key things that needs to be kind of followed in the risk management life cycle. As a leader, you need to establish the risk culture, risk tone of the risk within the organization. You need to be establishing your risk appetite, the policy framework or policy governance, establish the rules and follow it by example, and ensure that all the policies are appropriately applied and addressed within the organization. So this is about governance, risk, and compliance.